Hello and welcome to another episode of Father and Joe. I am Joe Rockey here with Father Boniface Hicks. And Father, I want to continue that conversation about performing God's will on earth as it is in heaven. And the major takeaway from that was, well, God is love. Love is what heaven is. And we talked a little bit of things about how to build up love within yourself, how to trust in your abilities to discern what is and what isn't. And I wanted to turn this towards maybe the other side of the fence, because that the conversation was, I took away from it at least, was actions that we can do positively to help each other. And one of the areas that I think that people sometimes can get into a hole in, and in fact, doing a little bit of research, there's an entire segment, there's entire church literature about the opposite of this, which is it's okay that you love yourself and that you take care of yourself, and that in not doing so does not make you fulfilling what the Jesus said in the Bible of, being fasting and letting other people know about it, is literally what he says not to do. So whether you're suffering in silence intentionally, but still putting on an act going out in the world, is not what God meant either. So I wanted to use this episode to kind of talk about the notion of loving yourself and how that can be a representation of heaven and fulfilling the command from the Our Father.
Yeah, we do have some complexity around that concept, as you point out. We, on the one hand, don't want to be narcissistic, and to go back to the Greek myth from which that word is generated, Narcissus was so fascinated with his own reflection in the water that eventually he fell in and drowned. So it's not about being fixated on ourselves or, somehow adoring ourselves or making a god out of ourselves. And yet it is the total opposite would be something like self-hatred or self-disregard or self-destruction even, or so clearly that's the opposite extreme. Whereas proper stewardship for our humanity, proper care for our own person, would be moving more towards the center. And then in terms of how we can feel about ourselves, there's no problem in having some delight around our life, that we're grateful for who God made us to be, and we love perhaps the gifts that we're able to offer or qualities that we have. And because ultimately to hate ourselves would be to go contrary to how God views us. God delights in us. God says that we are beloved and we are good. And to say the opposite is to contradict God. So that's problematic. We can hate our sins. Even there, we need a little bit of care and nuance, because sometimes what we think is sin is not always sin exactly. It's not part of being perfect in love, and yet it wasn't intentionally bad. Sometimes out of weakness, we do things that we regret, and then we can end up having some shame and then self-disdain around those areas in our life. But in any event, so Jordan Peterson says something like, treat yourself like you would treat somebody worth caring for. I forget exactly, he says it in a nice way, but I remember one of the examples he brings out is, if your dog were sick, you would be sure to administer the medication at the proper hours. And yet when you are sick, you don't take care of yourself that well to even administer a medication to yourself at the proper hours or to keep it up over time. or whatever it might be. Sometimes we are more regular, more dependable, even more generous in caring for pets than we are about caring for ourselves. And there's a distortion there, for sure. We're certainly not valuing the life that God has given, has created in us by acting that way. And so just to elevate our self-care to a place that would be in line with certainly how we treat our pets, but then even how we treat our loved ones, a spouse or children or friends or coworkers even, that we would give ourselves the same respect, care, reverence that we would give to them. So I think it's a good starting point for how to properly understand an ordered self-love.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of looking at it and approaching the caring. And I think that's almost one of these things where, and I get it, we're having this conversation during Lent when we're actively looking at our excesses and trying to shave them away as a way to come closer to Christ. But even in that sentence itself, you see that there is a reasonable amount that you're supposed to have, as you said, to steward your humanity, which includes things such as food, obviously the basics you need to live, food, water, health, etc. But there's also things like joy and, accomplishment and stuff of that nature that fuels part of your humanity as well. And wanting to participate or win a competition or something like that is not contrary to the principal conversation here of acting in love and trying to do God's will on earth as it is in heaven. So to say another way is that those things can still exist, competition and all that. People will use the metaphor of, oh, now he's playing baseball with the Angels. That kind of thing, would not necessarily be wrong in the way that we view the faith. So I want to point that out because I think that there's so many times that when we get caught into it's better just to make myself suffer because that makes me closer to Jesus, because we obviously know about all the sufferings that Jesus went through. But that's not the way that I've taken the conversation we've had in this episode and the last one. So I wanted to, I don't know if that error in logic is the way to describe that mentality or what, but dive in upon that point.
Yeah. A couple things there. That the idea that something is better if it's harder, or that somehow it's better if we're suffering more, or something like that, is certainly a faulty notion. As virtue grows, we can do things to an excellent degree, and it becomes easier, and we do it more spontaneously and with more joy. We've actually just oriented our whole body, mind, heart, soul around the good in a way that, like, we want to do it, and we're good at doing it, and we do it. And that's what we're made to do. So it's not like Jesus' whole childhood was wasted because he didn't suffer enough or something like that. It's a ridiculous idea. But it really comes in through Immanuel Kant, especially, who did have that idea that basically feelings can't be trusted, and going against our feelings, doing the hard thing all the time is always the best. And so the idea that harder is better is really his idea, but it's not a Christian idea. He had a suspicion of our human nature, that our human nature was wild in a way that could only be tamed through that kind of forcing of ourselves, rather than the idea that our human nature is really oriented to the good and to doing God's will. It just needs to be trained lovingly towards that end and continually tuned into it. So the idea that the harder thing is the better thing is certainly not true. And we should set that aside, first of all.
So why I appreciate the answer. So just by being harder does not make you inherently closer to God just because you're choosing to suffer. I mean, there's plenty of saints that did suffer. You know, Saint Teresa had chemicals thrown upon her that burnt her, but she wasn't a saint because that happened to her. She was a saint because she was humble and figured out how to turn everything towards God. It's not that she was looking for, you know, give me chemicals to pain me. It was, I'm not going to outlash at my, you know, persecutor. I'm going to figure out how to turn this situation to God, and how you mentioned when you become deep in virtue, that continues. So that was down the lines of where you were going, if that jogged your memory.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Yeah. So, what is humility, and what is the role of hard things? So I just said that the goal is not as many hard things as possible. Well, why ever do anything hard, or is there any value? Absolutely there is, because a lot of times as we start doing something new, it does tend to be hard. And so persevering through the hard initial phases, you know, and you can make the easy analogies around learning to play a sport, or learning to play a musical instrument, or learning some other skill. We often struggle at it at first. And so persevering through those hard things, and sometimes we're in circumstances that are particularly hard. And our bodies kind of rebel against that, but for a higher purpose, we stay in the hard circumstance. You know, I was just talking to a father who runs a big business, but for a couple days, he had to sleep with his two older children while the newborn stayed away from them because they were sick. So at a time when he actually needed the strength and the sleep through the night, he exposed himself to sickness and had interrupted sleep so that he could take care of his children and protect his most vulnerable child. And we say, wow, good for him. That's really beautiful. He made a real sacrifice for them. And so there is a role for sacrifice. There is a role for hard things. Certainly the Passion of Christ demonstrates the depth of his love for us as well. So there is a role for that. It's just the fallacy is that's the only thing that's valuable, or more of that is strictly better. And so that's not true. We do hard things for a higher purpose. And we have to keep ordering ourselves toward that higher purpose. To return to the theme from last episode, that higher purpose is love. We're willing to suffer and sacrifice for the sake of the beloved. And so we put that first. We put our own comfort lower down the line, even to the point that we sacrifice for it. Now, there are other ways we could take care of the beloved most of the time that don't require as much suffering and sacrifice. And in fact, our capacity to be present, to enjoy, to delight is precisely the thing that's needed, not just our endless sacrifices. So enjoying the beloved is also a way to excel in love. And then just a word about humility, and then it makes me think of the Clifton Strengths, like Gallup's Strengths Finder. I'm not good at everything. You know, the idea that it's easier for me to talk on a podcast than to play professional basketball, and therefore I should really work on my professional basketball skills so that I can play professional basketball. No, I'm never going to play professional basketball. It's not; those are not skills I have now or will ever have. And so, whereas the things that I am doing now are things that I can do well and I can keep growing in, and so. Now, if somebody, whatever, puts a gun to my head or something and says, play professional basketball, or I'm going to kill your family or something, well, obviously, I'm going to make a sacrifice for a higher purpose and be horrible at that. That's terrible. Gosh, that sounds really violent. Whatever. Anyway, you can think of various things. Well, let's actually bring it a little closer to home. You know, if I had to work a job that I'm not good at because otherwise my family will go without food, right? Then I'm going to work that job and I'm going to do the best I can. And it's going to be really hard, and it might be really hard every day. And that's remarkable. That's a beautiful quality. And there are people who do that, and it is admirable. So, but if they were able to get a job which was more in their skill set, which was more in their enjoyment set, which was more more like their unique design, do that instead if it still provides for the family. But the way we order our priorities is going to determine some of the decisions that we have to make. And if we're really ordering love as the highest priority, then sometimes we do really hard things like that, work jobs that we're not good at, and maybe even for a long time. So, but anyway, humility is not saying I'm terrible. It's just being honest. I am bad at professional basketball, bad at basketball in general. I'm good at speaking. And to say I'm good at speaking is not an act of pride any more than to say I'm bad at basketball is an act of self-hatred. These are just facts by reasonable objective measures. And so, and then again, the point being to be honest with ourselves is then to invest ourselves in the things that we are most suited for, all things being equal. And then we can learn to excel in those things.
Yeah, and so one of the big takeaways I had from there was you're not designed to orient your life to suffering. That is not what Jesus did. That's not what you're called to do. You're also called to recognize that your strengths, your talents, and your skills, while there is an obligation to grow and enhance them, it is not to grow and enhance all of them that are outside of your natural state. Like you, I will never hit a three-pointer in any meaningful situation, and I'm okay with that. But that does not mean I neglect the things that I am good at. Talking to people, figuring out problems, etc. And that is the way to look at it, is that we're not saying that we should limit our abilities or our strengths into very tiny, isolated things where all I can do is these four things. No, it's you recognize your greater skills, your greater abilities, and your gifts that you've been given and figure out how to grow them. And ultimately, then to take this to the conclusion of all of this, how to serve everyone, which is in itself an act of love, making yourself better to be able to better perform, and whatever the case might be is an answer. So, one of these things is, Father, as you get better presenting a podcasting using that example, as YouTube picks that up and more people watch it, because you spent the time learning and getting better, that message that you were able to give later in life impacted more people and had more ripple effect, therefore spreading the message you're trying to. So I think that that's a natural way of looking at life and how to communicate. It's not about orienting yourself to suffering. It doesn't mean that you don't take care of yourself. Loving yourself is an important part of doing God's will on earth as is in heaven. So, Father, I want to give you a chance to bring any concluding thoughts here today's episode before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful opportunity to take a new look at our own lives and see how we're ordering them to God's law of love. And I should say with all of these things, we ask for his help. So I described a lot about our own kind of inner awareness, working through wounds, not just choosing the hardest path, but choosing the best path, which may also in some cases be the hardest path, determining the best path against the ideal of love. I should also say, God is with us in this. He has a vested interest in our success. And so we can call on his help as well. And as we ask for God's help in every situation, we'll discover that he is there for us and he'll help us to find the best way.
Absolutely. And we thank you all for listening to us on whichever system you are acquiring us through, whether it be Apple, Google, YouTube, whatever the case might be. And we do ask that if you haven't yet, please find us over on YouTube and just give that little subscribe, because one of the things that obviously we try to do things to help people, and being on YouTube is a place to be able to play in Google's algorithms to have a little bit greater impact in the broader society beyond just sharing this to an individual. So we thank everyone who's willing to help and do that. And we will be with you again next week.